Hello, History 2 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 22, Section 2, The Reagan Years. So, Roman number 1, the road to the White House. What people did Reagan's 1980s campaign for presidency appeal to? Well, these were Americans, for the most part, who were frustrated with the economy and afraid that our nation was looking weak. Coming out of the Carter administration, we had kind of dealt with inflation. We had stagflation before that under Ford. So there were people that were hoping that maybe a conservative like Ronald Reagan would help stimulate the economy. And then along with that, as far as our standing as a weak nation, we're coming out of the era of Vietnam. And for the most part, a lot of Americans kind of saw us as maybe not being as strong as we had been militarily. But with the Iran hostage crisis, a lot of people felt like we had been deflated, that Carter kind of dropped the ball as far as what we could have done to get those individuals out of the Middle East before things got bad. So Reagan certainly was a guy who looked very promising to a lot of voters. So in letter B, what did Reagan promise to do if he were elected president? And some of the things that he promised was to cut taxes because taxes had been rising, and he wanted to increase defense spending. This whole idea that our military, for the most part, after the Vietnam War, had been downsized. And there was great fear that if we allowed our country to become weak, certainly we could be in situations where other hostage takers would be out there, and the United States would look kind of like a bumbling fool. At the same time, we're still concerned about the Cold War. And I just want you to notice there's a photograph here, kind of on the right side, of Ronald Reagan and his wife Nancy, and a very famous fella, John Paul the Great, or St. John Paul the Great. John Paul, for the most part, from Poland, knew firsthand about the rise of communism because he had lived it, and certainly was fighting communism throughout his time in Poland as a priest and bishop, cardinal. Ronald Reagan and him sometimes are kind of mentioned as being two of the guys who helped bring an end to the Cold War, spiritually on one side and militarily on the other. So, domestic policies. Anytime we talk about domestic policies, we're talking about our policies at home. So, how did Reagan propose to cut the deficit and to keep the deficit under control? And one of the things that he wanted to do, very similar, kind of sounds like Nixon, wanted to cut welfare programs, wanted to cut school lunch programs, cut back on food stamps, cut back on Medicare, cut back on unemployment benefits, cutting back on student loans, and also cutting back on housing subsidies. All these are things that probably touch the hearts of a lot of people here in the United States. Granted, you could be an individual who is not necessarily on welfare, but if you had student loans, for the most part, that might hit home to you. So these are things that would have cut back on spending, and some of these programs did get cut. Under letter B, when did economic expansion begin to take place and what were the results? Well, by 1984, and this would have been about the time that Reagan is preparing to run again for a second term, we started seeing some real big jumps here. Income was rising. There were a lot of new businesses being developed. There were jobs being created. Unemployment fell. And when Reagan campaigns for his second term, he asked America if they are better off in 1984 than they were 4 years ago. And it was really hard for most Americans to deny that they weren't better off. And hence, it makes it really easy for Reagan to win his reelection. Roman numeral 3. Reagan oversees a military buildup. We mentioned before that Reagan certainly was concerned about the power or the menace of the Soviet Union, and so this is kind of focusing on that. What did Reagan believe would happen to the Soviet Union if the United States continued to build up its military resources? Well, he believed that if the Soviets tried to, for the most part, keep up with us or to match our buildup, their economy would be stressed and they would be forced to implement some kind of reforms. In other words, let's push them to the brink. And in a way, we did. And what's interesting is as we build up our military and we start, building more weapons and putting more people into the military force, the Soviet Union eventually comes to our door wanting to talk. And in a way, this is the chipping of the ice in our Cold War. And I would have to say Reagan has a lot to do with bringing about the end to the Cold War as far as some of these policies. In letter B, how did Reagan's defense spending affect the annual budget deficit? Well, this is one of those areas where conservatives who don't typically like deficits are going to be, in a sense, eating their words. Reagan's defense spending really did push the deficit from about $80 billion to around $200 billion, which in today's terms seems relatively small, but at the time was astronomical. Yes, Reagan did build up a deficit, and that is something that typically conservative Republicans don't like doing, but it did happen. Letter C. What was the Reagan Doctrine? Well, the Reagan Doctrine was a policy that the United States should support guerrilla groups who were trying to overthrow communist or pro-Soviet governments. And the United States during the 1980s did support a handful of governments, particularly in Latin America, the Nicaraguans for the most part. We were providing support for them. We were also providing support in El Salvador to those people who were fighting the socialists and the communists down there. And needless to say, sometimes this gets you into trouble. And that leads us to the Iran-Contra scandal. The Iran-Contra scandal, this is basically when some individuals or people within Reagan's administration illegally and secretly sold weapons to Iran in exchange for the release of the American hostages. This is going back to right about January of 1981 when Reagan was sworn in as president. But that money that was basically gathered from the sale of weapons and the release of those hostages eventually went into buying weapons to help guerrilla forces in places like Nicaragua, particularly the Nicaraguan Contras, who were fighting a group known as the Sandinistas, who were primarily pro-Marxist or pro-communist. Needless to say, this whole scandal doesn't really come to the surface until we get to about 1986, 1987. And we're kind of in the final days of the Reagan administration when this all kind of blows up. And the question is who authorized it, who ordered it? You see a photograph there of Lieutenant Oliver North, Lieutenant Colonel. He was as they call him, the clean Marine. He did serve a little bit of time in jail. But, what's interesting is Oliver North, because of his ties to this scandal, actually made a career for himself. He went on to become a commentator for conservative talk radio, and he is basically going to become the president of the NRA here within a matter of time. Letter E. What is nuclear deterrence or mutual assured destruction, or AKA MAD, if you take a look at the acronym here? This is a strategy that assumed that as long as the U.S. and the USSR could both destroy each other with nukes, that they would be afraid of going to an all-out nuclear war. Hence, we would build up the nuclear arsenal, but we would never use it. Letter F. What was the Strategic Defense Initiative, aka Star Wars? This was a plan that called for the development weapons that could intercept and destroy incoming missiles, particularly intercontinental nuclear warheads. And the way it was touted by the Reagan administration was actually Star Wars. This idea that we'd have these satellites up in space that would shoot lasers, and they could, for the most part, knock these intercontinental missiles out of the atmosphere. Needless to say, sounds like a really interesting plan, but it never came to fruition. And matter of fact, we've had other presidents, particularly George W. Bush, who wanted to bring back this idea. But as far as the technology, we're not quite there yet to make a strategic defense shield of the world. Letter G. What was the first treaty that called for the destruction of nuclear weapons? And that was the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, or sometimes known as the INF Treaty, that was signed back in 1987. Interesting fact that, Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, who you see pictured there signing this agreement, really were butting heads. And Reagan did something that I think maybe other presidents wouldn't have done. When Gorbachev said he refused to give up his weapons, Reagan basically said, I'm leaving the negotiations, and for the most part picked up his stuff and left. Within short order, the Soviets were willing to start negotiating. So in a way, it was kind of like a game of cards. A lot of strategy being used here. Thank you very much.